We have now reached the third step in our do-it-yourself large solar generator build. On this step we will be mounting the various components. If you've missed the previous steps, you can find the links to those in the video description or on the blog post that goes with this video. All the major components are available on Amazon. We're going to start by taping off the case so that as we add marks to it, we can change them or move them later without adding marks to our case. This is the LED work lamp. We're going to start by positioning that over on this side, as well as the switch that goes with that. Now, if you decide to place your components in a different location than I do, keep in mind you will also need to factor in how the internal components are located, where the screws go through, and how the wiring will be placed. Currently, I'm just doing the outline of the LED work lamp, the toggle switch to turn it on and off. Here is the 12-volt power control panel, as well as a toggle switch for it, and then I've also added a circle for the AC charging port. And here's some additional tape on the other side for where we're going to place our main inverter control switch, as well as the GFCI outlet for power. Again, keep in mind that these are not cut lines. These are placement lines so that we're just working out where everything will be located. Most of these components have a flange on them for better weatherproofing, and the cut line will actually be much smaller than the outline of the component itself. Okay, here I am measuring the flange and placing some cut lines on our box. We will probably mark them a little bit on the small side because it's easier to trim them bigger than to go the other way, and we want to make sure we have a nice snug fit that is also weather tight. Now I'm doing my cuts with a multi-tool with a plunge cut blade on there. Because this is plastic, you could use a variety of things to cut this. This makes pretty quick work of the plastic, and it's pretty precise for following the lines. You could use a variety of tools, anywhere from even just a sharp utility knife, a file for widening the hole. There's a lot of things you can do. The tools I use just make it pretty quick and easy. You will also see me using a rotary pneumatic die grinder with a burr cutting wheel on it, or burr cutting bit rather, and I will also be using a variety of drill bits and hole saws. Some common other hand tools that would work well for trimming it out would be a rough file for filing the plastic to a larger size when needed, and I will also be using an assortment of drill bits and hole saws. Here we have the first hole cut, and we're going to do a test fit. As you can see, it didn't quite fit. I was erring on the small side, so I'm taking a marker to just mark the high spots where I need to do a little bit additional trimming. That could also have been accomplished with a utility knife or a file. The toggle switch holes have a 13/16 inch hole that makes sure that the clip will fit securely after it's pushed in. I'm drilling a pilot hole here first to get a good center point, and then using the large 13/16 inch bit. Here we are doing a test fit. There are some clips to these switches that are designed to keep them in, but I've found in the past that they don't hold up under long-term use, so I will also take a hot melt glue gun to reinforce those toggle switches at one point. And for the 12-volt gauge pod, we have 3 holes to cut, each 1 1/8 inch. I'm going to go ahead and mark the center point for the first hole, and we will actually use the pod itself as a template for the remaining 2. So pretty much all you need to be worried about initially is the first hole, and we're going to use a hole saw for that. And we're going to go ahead and remove the threaded lock rings on the back of each of the 3 holes. And then go ahead and disassemble the components from 2 of the items, but leave the one in for the hole that we already drilled, and go ahead and thread the locking ring back in on the back side. This is going to give us a template for cutting the remaining 2 holes. And then I'm going to remove the drill bit from the center of my hole saw so that I can just use the template or the guide of the pod itself to center the bit. And once the first one's done, go ahead and fit the side, the component for that side, and that'll hold everything in place while we drill the last hole. Next up is going to be the AC input for when we want to use the battery maintainer trickle charger. And this will allow us to keep the batteries topped off and maintain a nice healthy voltage when the unit is in storage. It is going to require a hole of 1 7/8 inch. And I found a socket with the outside diameter of 1 7/8 inch to make my outline. We're going to go ahead and put a pilot hole as close to the center as possible. Now I did not have a 1 7/8 inch hole saw, so I'm going to go ahead and use my burr cutter to just cut out as close to that circle as I possibly can. Once we get pretty close, we are going to go ahead and take the cord, place it in there, and do a test fit. I have a couple little spots I needed to clean out to get a good fit, so I'm marking those. And now we have a good fit. Now for the other components, we need to make it weather tight. So we are adding some RTV black silicone sealant, and this will produce a weather tight seal around all of our components. We are putting that on the LED flood lamp, the 12 volt gauge pod, as well as my 2 toggle switches. And we're going to give that about 15 minutes or longer if you want to start to cure. It doesn't have to be completely dry. Now our AC input has a nice rubber gasket, so it's not necessary. These red caps I've found to be really handy, by the way, for closing up your tubes so that they don't dry out. And I'm installing this with the screws that it came with. Be careful not to over tighten. And we're going to put in our LED flood lamp, and we're going to use the existing hardware that it came with. Again, go ahead and get them close if you have a power tool, but I recommend hand tightening because you don't want to over tighten most of these components. If any of your silicone leaks out through the edges, just go ahead and wipe it. Because it's black in color, it will be virtually invisible once everything's dried. Now the toggle switches are designed to stay in with the clip that they have built in, and it will work for the most part, but I found that they tend to get loose over time with lots of use. So we're going to later go back in with the glue gun, and we're going to reinforce them from the backside just to make sure that they don't pop out on us while we're using it. Here we're installing the 12 volt gauge pod, and this is just held in place with the plastic threaded collars that thread in from behind. Okay, here I have everything mounted. So we have the toggle switch for our LED flood lamp. We have a toggle switch for our 12 volt gauge pod that has a voltage gauge, 5 volt USB outputs, and a 12 volt cigarette output. And then our AC input for our battery tender, which the way these works is they accept a extension cord, and you can pretty much just be popped out with a quick yank, and you can close up the boot and keep everything weather tight. Alright, moving on to the inverter remote control switch. Here I am outlining the cut line, cutting it out. And then for the GFCI outlet, we are going to use a weatherproof cover, and we will need to create the cut just where the outlet itself would go through the side of the case. Do a test fit. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and put the RTV silicone on our remote control switch. Now I'm using the screws that the remote switch came with. Be very careful not to over tighten these. I started to over tighten the one corner here and it crushed a little bit. So definitely be careful on the tightening of these screws. This is after I have the outlet all mounted up. I actually have not mounted this yet. This is easier to do after we connect the wiring, which I'm about to show you next. You want to use 12 gauge wire for the inside of wiring from the inverter to this outlet, because this is a pretty big inverter and we want to make sure that our wiring is up to the capacity of any of the equipment we might be using. I found we can actually use a 12 volt, or I'm sorry, rather a three prong outlet extender adapter, and that gives us the 12 gauge wiring with a plug already wired to the one end. We can make our pigtail from that. These are the wire strippers that I talked about in one of my other videos. And we're going to use the green connector to the green screw lug on the inverter, the white to the neutral, which is usually silver, and the black to the copper one, which is labeled hot. Do not connect any wires where the yellow warning sticker is on your GFCI outlet. Those are used for different applications. Now, we're not going to use the electrical screws that it comes with. We want to use the heavier number 10 24 thread machine screws, which we do need to widen our holes a little bit on our outlet as well as on our cover. But this will give us a much more secure mounting on our Pelican kit. And here I am placing it all together. We're going to go ahead and insert our heavier duty machine screws through. And on the back side, we're going to use a lock nut as well as a spring washer to secure it. And this is a very heavy duty secure mounting now. Next up is a 350 amp high current plug. This will be used for jumper cables, as well as if you want to chain additional batteries or expand our unit. You could also use it for other high current loads, such as utility winches. Now, this does not have a flange, so we do want to make sure we get a nice precise outline. We're going to try to cut this as tight as possible, which is important for keeping it weather tight and also for getting our component mounted as sturdy as possible. Here I'm doing a test fit, and as you can see, I just barely can work it in. That's about where you want it. We're going to position this on the last raised rib, and once you get that positioned right, you can back it out just a little bit. That'll allow us to put our RTV silicone in that gap really nicely, and then we'll push it back in onto that last raised rib to kind of force some of the RTV into the gap. Okay, and once that is pushed into the right place, we then go ahead and take our hot melt glue gun and we put a real heavy bead of hot melt glue on the backside to secure this in place. Now we're moving on to the solar charger, or I'm sorry, the solar panel input, which we are going to use a 6-pin trailer cable. This gives us a nice heavy duty high current connection that's weather tight, and they're very inexpensive as well. The hole you'll need is a 1 1/4 inch. We're going to go ahead and drill our pilot hole, and then we're going to take a 1 1/4 inch hole saw to make the final hole. Because we're using a 30 amp solar charge controller, we want to make sure we're using at least 14 gauge wire. You'll want a couple feet of wire that we're going to pre-wire to our trailer connector. The red wire is going to go to the center pin, and the black wire will go to the lug that's labeled ground. Once you get that nice and pre-wired, go ahead and put some RTV silicone for good measure on the outside perimeter of the inside of the connector. And then we're going to go ahead and mount that with the hardware that came with the kit for our trailer connector. And again, it's usually easier to drill these holes after you already have the component in place. And then go ahead and tighten that up with the existing hardware. Once you have it mounted in place, don't forget the plastic boot that the connector came with to help protect the lugs on the backside so we don't accidentally short anything out with other things that we decide to place in our case later. Okay, moving on to the internal components. We want to put the battery as close to the wheels as possible because that'll help keep the heaviest part down low when moving the case around either on the wheels or by carrying it. Now, because these wheels have protrusions or wheel wells inside there, I wasn't able to get it in tightly into the corners I wanted. So we built a couple 2x2 pieces of wood out of a scrap 2x4 to help shim that and make it so we can mount that securely in place. Here's my 2x2s, and I've just placed them like so on the bottom of the case so that it builds a level platform for the battery to sit on, and we can now push the battery snug into the corner, and it's braced on all three sides. Now we are going to have to mount the battery, the universal battery mount, to the side of the case rather than below, and the reason for that is because we cannot put any holes through the bottom or back side of this case because of the sliding opening luggage style handle that retracts and expands from the back. So I got the battery placed, and I also took a hot melt glue gun to hold the wooden shims in place for when the battery is removed they won't fall out of place. Here I'm mocking up where the battery mount will go, and determine where you want the hole for the bolts to go through. Keep in mind that we will need to make sure they don't interfere with the handles on the outside of the case. Once you find a good spot for the bolt to come through, go ahead and mark it. The top one will help you to determine where to put the bottom one. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and put the bottom bolt through before we place the battery back in, because it's much easier to do first. Go ahead and put our battery in place, and then thread our top bolt in. And go ahead and flip the case around so that you can see the bolts. And we want to keep this weather tight as possible, so I'm going to add a couple washers as well as a couple O-rings that were not included in our battery mount kit. Basically the idea is that we're going to use the washers to sandwich the O-ring against the plastic case, and this will keep these holes weather tight as well. Go ahead and thread the wing nuts on. Now these nuts, or these bolts, are much longer than we actually need, so once you get it snugged down, go ahead and mark where you can cut the bolts, but make sure you do leave enough room that you'll be able to get them started before you start tightening. Go ahead and cut the excess length off. And that's everything for the battery mount. We're going to go ahead and leave the battery out for now and move on to the inverter. Go ahead and attach the included leads with the inverter. You can put the red one to the side to add clearance for our power switch. The negative black cable can actually be rotated 90 degrees, which will make routing of the wire a little easier once we have it mounted. This is also a good time to go ahead and connect the remote data switch, the remote switch for the remote control switch. And once that is all hooked up, go ahead and place it in the box and slide the inverter up a little bit from the bottom. This will give us a little bit of air for ventilation to help cool the inverter, as well as give us a place to tuck some of our wires later on. It's easiest to go ahead and drill the bottom holes first. And we're going to use the number 10 by 24 machine screws for these. Once we have the bottom screws in, we can place the bottom mounting tabs onto them, and then use that to determine the mounting point for the upper bolts. And then we go ahead and use the same number 10 by 24 machine screws for the upper tabs as well. That gives us a nice secure mount. Moving on to the solar charge controller. These are also much easier to wire ahead of time. The plastic gates on the bottom, you can use a screw to open up the gates. And we're going to take more of our 14 gauge wire, probably about 2 feet of length. And this wire will be what eventually goes to our battery, but we'll be wiring that up in the next step. But for now, go ahead and connect them to the 2 gates that show the battery icon, red to the plus, black to the negative. Go ahead and tighten those gates down nice and secure. Then we're going to go ahead and take the wires from our solar connector that we just connected earlier, and we're going to go ahead and strip those. And we're going to wire those to the gates that has the solar panel icon. And again, red to the pos and the black to the negative. Make sure that these connections are nice and tight. You don't want any loose connections with a solar panel setup because it'll drop voltage, and with a solar panel setup you want to get as much of that voltage out of that panel as you possibly can. So here you see the 4 connections that we just made. Okay, go ahead and place where you want to mount this. Keep in mind where the bolt holes will protrude. We want to make sure that they won't interfere with any of our handles on the outside of the case. Once you have it positioned where you think it will work well, go ahead and mark the left-hand side. And we want to go ahead and drill both of the left-hand bolts and use our number 10 by 24 machine screws to go ahead and mount it in place on that side. Give them a good snug just to keep it from moving too much. And then go ahead and now drill the holes for the right-hand side using the tabs as a template. And go ahead and put in the remaining 2 bolts and snug everything down. Okay, the last internal component we need to mount on this step is the battery tender maintainer. And we can go ahead and plug the power cord for that into our AC input cord. This could also be connected later, but it's easiest just to do it now and get it tucked out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and place this as low into the back of the case as out of the way as possible. This is not something that'll get very warm, so we don't need to worry about heat dissipation or anything like that. Once we have the position where we want, go ahead and mark and drill the bottom hole. Use one of our number 10 by 24 machine screws. And then we use the same process of marking and inserting the top post. Okay, once that is done, we're going to go ahead and just tidy up some of our wires. We're going to be moving those and finishing to wire those up in the next step. The one thing we have not mounted on the outside of the case yet is our top LED flood lamp. And the reason we waited to do this until last is we wanted to make sure it wouldn't interfere with any of our internal components where it protrudes through. I decided to put mine towards the front edge. I've already marked it just like before, follow the same procedures, and go ahead and cut it out. Once you get a good fit, go ahead and then drill your, or mark for your toggle switch. You can also go ahead and drill your holes for the mounting bolts as well. Once we know where we want to put our switch, go ahead and determine the center point. And we will drill the hole for that just like before as well. Once the holes are all made, go ahead and remove our masking tape. We're going to use the RTV silicone sealant again, just like before, around the perimeter of both of these components. Pushing our toggle switch into place, wiping off any excess sealant. And the same thing for our top LED flood lamp. And we're going to use the hardware that it came with for mounting this as well. And that wraps up all of the steps for number 3. On the next step, we will go ahead and add some fuse panels and the remaining wiring on the internal of the case.